Hello everybody, my name is Felix Wemheuer and I'm Professor for Modern China Studies at the University of Cologne. This is my YouTube channel, Studying Maoist China. And after a long time I'm now back in the studio again to produce some videos that will introduce you to important issues of global Maoism. And today I want to start with the first video, Global Maoism, the Rise. And I like to answer the question, why did Maoism become a global political force in the 1960s and 1970s? This is partly my point of view for my own research. I also edited a volume on Maoism in the German-speaking world, and I did some oral history projects with students in Austria and Germany with former Maoists. But I also will comment on the books of other scholars here. So in this first video I want to explain the rise of Maoism, and in a second video the decline of global Maoism. So first let me start with a historical background. Some historians are using the concept of global revolutionary cycles or waves, and one important cycle appeared after World War II in the global south in relation to decolonialization, where many anti-imperialist movements occurred, and many of them considered themselves in the 1950s and 1960s as socialists or communists. And in the 1960s the Chinese government would argue that the center of the revolution had moved to what we call now global south, later was called the third world. At that time they called it Yafela, Asia, Africa and Latin America. So first let me start to explain this revolutionary cycles on the three continents according to my view. I think in Asia it started with the independence of Vietnam in 1945, and of course also the Chinese Revolution of 1949 was part of this revolutionary cycle in Asia. But like everything, also a cycle comes to an end, and I think it ended maybe finally with the Vietnamese invasion in Cambodia in 78, and then the following war between China and Vietnam 1 year later. And I think this destroyed this whole dream also of the Western New Left of a kind of united anti-imperialist camp of the third world, and it somehow also destroyed this narratives of liberation struggle, because two of these major actors of this national liberation movement were at war against each other. I think in Latin or South America, maybe one cycle started with the Cuban Revolution of '59, and it ended with the right-wing military coup in Chile in '73, when later many Latin American countries were turned into military dictatorships with the support of the US, and then most of the places they were then successful to crush leftist movements and to crush guerrilla movements. In Africa, I think in the 1950s, one of the most important and prominent struggle was the war of independence of Algeria, starting in 54, and what it was inspired by the victory of the North Vietnamese communist forces over the French Empire in Dien Phu, and it ended the struggle with the independence of Algeria in 62. And in the 1960s and early 1970s, many governments in Africa would label their own system as African or Arabic socialism. I think in the late 1970s the change under the influence of the World Bank and international monetary funds. Many governments moved in a different direction, more in a neoliberal direction, and opened up to the world market. In this period of the 1960s and early 1970s, when these several revolutionary cycles appeared, the Chinese government would present itself as one center of the world revolution and friend of all this liberation movement. However, China was not the only country. Also, Cuba made these claims, was maybe more active in Africa than China. Also, Algeria considers themselves as the center of the world revolution, Vietnam, and also partly North Korea. And what is then interesting around the year of 67 and 68, that these revolutionary cycles in the global south overlapped with student and workers' demonstration, protests, and uprisings in the centers of the capitalist world system. I think most prominently the general strike in France, and also then the student and worker struggles in Italy, but also some parts of the American civil rights movements radicalized. For example, the Black Panther Party was founded, who moved more into revolutionary directions. In Eastern Europe, at the same time, also several revolts occurred against Soviet rule, the uprising in Hungary in 1956, and then the Soviet invasion to crush the reform movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And interestingly, in 1968, also in Yugoslavia, student protest developed, but the government under Tito dealt with it in a more peaceful way. So this is the whole historical background to understand the rise of the Western New Left in the 1960s, early 1970s. So this Western New Left, most of them, they were opposed to both superpowers. The United States had lost credibility as a kind of a moral leader of the free world during the Vietnam War, when they wanted to destroy the country and bomb it back to the Stone Age. And the Soviet Union had lost a lot of credibility with the invasion in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. This new left made very strong references to this liberation movements in the Third World or Global South, how it was later it's called. And many people all around the globe felt that they were part of a great historical movement and moment that could change the world. If you want to understand this global environment, I want to recommend you a documentary by the French filmmaker Chris Marker, Grin Without a Cat, from 1977. I will put it into notes, and this is also from a left-wing point of view a very critical reflection also about the failure of these global movements. So in this second part, I will introduce you to different types of Maoism, also various positive perception of Mao's China, because not everyone had a positive view on China at that time was a Maoist. So it was very interesting, I think, that the Chinese government decided not to establish a communist international like the Bolshevik had done in the inter-war period. So some Maoist movements on the globe were supported by China, mainly in a global south, while others independently adopted Maoism. However, the archives of the Chinese Foreign Ministry are not open, and I think we still know very little about relations, for example, of China to Western Maoist groups. Why could Mao or Maoism become so popular? So one reason was also the ambiguity, I think, of Mao himself. On the one hand side, he was the leader of a highly hierarchical and centralized Leninist party state. On the other hand side, he presented himself as a friend of rebellion of workers and peasants against this party bureaucracy. During the Cultural Revolution, he did not stop students from destroying the so-called four old, like churches and monasteries, old books and so on. However, at the same time, he was a classical poet writing in classical Chinese and was also a great friend of traditional Chinese medicine. So now I want to summarize the several brands of Maoism or positive perception of the Chinese model. So the first would be Maoism as a rule-based guerrilla movement. So the whole idea of this kind of movements was that revolutionaries should move to the countryside, then establish revolutionary base area, carrying out a land reform in order to build a guerrilla army based on the peasantry. The idea that in a long-lasting people's war, the cities should be encircled from the countryside. And many of these movements, they used the labels that the CCP had used also for pre-49 China, semi-feudal and semi-colonial class structures to justify this kind of strategy. In some countries they also promoted, like Mao had done in the 1940s, a new democracy, so a kind of a broader class alliance for a national liberation struggle. These kinds of movements, I think, appeared in Vietnam, India, Malaysia, Turkey, Peru, Cambodia, and the Philippines, just to name a few. And at the same time, at least by the mid-1960s, the Chinese government would promote this model as a universal model to liberate Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So in his famous article, Long Live the Victory in the People's War, the Minister of Defense Lin Biao argued in 1965 that the center of the world revolution had moved to the global south, and he developed this strategy to encircle the cities kind of on a global scale. He argued that there would be very little revolutionary movements in the centers, urban centers of the world system. So the global villages should encircle the global cities. At the same time, in many countries, communist parties that allied with the Soviet Union already promoted a more reformist strategy or cooperated with governments. So this version of Maoism looked kind of very revolutionary, very radical compared to many Soviet-led parties. And Mao had argued that he had Sinicized Marxism-Leninism and he had adopted it to the local Chinese conditions. So leaders in other countries, they would argue that they had also localized Maoism that would fit the conditions of their countries. This strategy, of course, was a strategy of revolution and civil war, and resulted in cycles of violence and counter-violence by government forces. I think the most two brutal examples of this strategy are the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and the Chining Pass in Peru, where not only class enemies were killed, but also large parts of the rural population. If you're interested in this history, I would recommend you to read the book of Julia Novell. Here you can see the German version, Maoism, a global history. I think her focus is mainly on this guerrilla style Maoism and less on the forms of Maoism. I will talk later. And of course, important read regarding the Khmer Rouge and Maoism in Cambodia is the book by Matthew Galway, The Emergence of Global Maoism. And I also interviewed Matt for this channel. I will put it in the notes. I think the whole perception in this global southern countries that the Chinese communists had seized power based on a rural guerrilla struggle is partly a myth. As we look, for example, at the Chinese history and the Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 1949, guerrilla warfare played only a minor role. Very important was that the Soviet Union first had occupied Manchuria during the war against Japan, and then in 1956 retreated their forces from Manchuria, and this provided space for the Chinese communists to also to conquer or to liberate major industrial cities. And the following war was mainly a conventional warfare fought between two regular armies, where the People's Liberation Armies conquered then the South. The same is true for Vietnam, that at that time was always presented as a successful model for a rural guerrilla struggle. But also in Vietnam, finally, North Vietnam defeated the South in a regular warfare that also was supported by some guerrilla forces in the South, but they only played a minor role, and the victory in 1975 of the North Vietnamese forces was also heavily supported from the Soviet Union, providing tanks and modern weapons. So the second positive perception of Maoism I want to talk now is China as a third force in a bipolar world of the Cold War and the superpowers. Yeah. So China also had participated in the famous Bantung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, which is considered the birthplace of the so-called non-aligned movement. Many post-colonial countries from the South who did not want to participate in an arms race and competition of the two superpowers, and they were critical about both superpowers. At that time, China was still allied from the Soviet Union, but later they also argued in this direction. Starting from the mid-1960s, the Chinese government attacked US imperialism, and then also later called the Soviet Union social imperialism. China promoted a model of economic independence through self-reliance instead of getting huge economic aid and getting into debt with one of the two superpowers. And it's very interesting, I think, that China was not only popular as a kind of third force in a bipolar world in the global South, but also among neutralists in Western countries. For example, I give you the example from Western Germany, where the former Nazi and famous right-wing intellectual Carl Schmitt published a book about the theory of the partisan. He was, of course, an anti-communist, but he had shown some sympathies with Maoist China as a kind of a third force that could open a new space in a world that was divided between these two blocks. And of course, this is very interesting considering today also Xi Jinping promotes China as a forerunner of a multipolar world. The second positive perception of China would be the Cultural Revolution as an anti-bureaucratic youth revolt. This perception was especially very strong in Italy and France. In both countries during the 1960s, they had very strong and influential communist parties, I think, who already had partly integrated into the system and promoted a reform agenda. And when in 1968 or in Italy 1969, youth and young workers would revolt in factories and on the streets, both party leaderships, they tried to curb this radicalism in order to save their reformist agenda, and then also some kind of leftists were expelled from the Communist Party of Italy. And this left-wing dissidents of the French and Italian Communist Party, they saw strong parallels to China, where also, according to their view, party bureaucracy would suppress youth and workers' revolt that was supported the rebellion by Mao Zedong. I think this perception is linked to this whole debate about the definition of the revolutionary vanguard. The orthodox Leninists had argued that the vanguard would always be the Communist Party. But now this movement, they argued that if the party would betray the revolution or would become too reformist, then the people who would start the struggle and the fight could be the new vanguard. This is also shown very impressively in the documentary by Chris Macca. So in Italian, these left-wing dissidents of the official Communist Party, they founded a platform, Il Manifesto. Later it became even daily newspapers. And these texts from Il Manifesto were translated in many languages, also in German, and I think were very influential among the Western European New Left at this time, 69, and they argued that Mao had reintroduced the masses as a subject of revolutionary change that would revolutionize the party. And in Europe, in France and Italy, students occupied universities, and a critique of the university was very popular, that it would be a system to reproduce class hierarchies and traditional division of labor between workers and intellectuals. I warmly recommend to you to watch the movie of Jean-Luc Godard, Loi Chinoise, The Chinese, from 1967. There's a character named Véronique, and she argues in the movie that she wants to throw bombs at universities, that the universities will be closed. Students then could move to the countryside, participate in manual labor and become one with this people. So kind of this brand of Maoism would interpreted China kind as a model that would overcome hierarchical and excluding boundaries between university and society, between society and factory, between intellectual and manual labor, and also between political activism and academia. If you are interested in this, I would recommend to you the book of Fabio Lanza, The End of Concern. I also wrote a review of it. I will put it in the into the notes. At that time, this young activist, they read a widespread of literature, and there was sometimes a very innovative, sometimes a very weird mixture of ideas. So some of them would combine then Maoism with Western Marxism, critical theory, Freudian theories like, for example, William Reich, ideas from anti-authoritarian education and counterculture. In one of Louis Bonnell's movies, somebody makes a joke. If Mao really had said this, he does not understand Freud. Yeah. So there were kind of a lot of, I think, misunderstanding and misreadings what was going on in China. For example, by 1968 in China, the rebel organizations of the early Cultural Revolution had already been dissolved. In many places, the People's Liberation Army had violently restored order. And after the 9th Party Congress in 1969, also Mao called to restore party rule all over the society. By that point of time, there were no more open debates about class and politics, such as in late 1966 and in 1967, and ultra-leftist forces whose idea were somehow quite close to Western New Leftists were already crushed by the state apparatus. However, I think some of these debates in France and Italy were quite interesting and creative and productive misunderstanding of Maoism. And it's still worth, I think, to write this intellectual history. And this is, I would say, not really covered in the book of Julia Lowell. So the fifth brand of Maoism I want to talk about, no, it's only the fourth actually, is Maoism as a model for building a Leninist party of cadres. So the anti-authoritarian student revolt had passed its peak in many Western countries by 1970 or 1971. For example, in Germany, some activists called for the end of the anti-authoritarian period, and some of these activists now called to establish new communist parties. And by that point of time, a more orthodox interpretation of Marxism-Leninism became more popular, that contrasted itself as real Marxist-Leninist opposed to Soviet revisionism. Most of them, they would not call themselves Maoist. Now they did not read Wilhelm Reich, but Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And also many groups studied the infamous Stalinist short course of the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik, in order to learn how to build a party. Now the slogan of the day was strict party discipline, and also many people who would not follow it would be expelled from this organization, and they split in many groups where most of the groups had the agenda that they wanted to become the exclusive vanguard of the working class in their country. And in Germany, Western Germany, these groups were called K groups because they all started with a K for communist. And I think there is interesting parallel to China, because by that point of time, the early 1970s, party rule was restored in China all over the society, and order and discipline was the focus of the day, not rebellion or lively debates like in some places during the early Cultural Revolution. So I think these Maoist parties in Western countries, they had passed their peak by the mid-1970s, and many of them, they will dissolved by the early 1980s. And the last positive perception of Maoist China I want to introduce here is urban guerrilla warfare. So by the early 1970s, for example, in West Germany, the Red Army faction was formed, RAF, and in their first declaration to launch an armed struggle in Western Germany, you can find many quotations from Mao Zedong, and they did not believe that the working class in their country would be very revolutionary. Their major references were the liberation movements in the Global South. They called to bring the war home in order to support these movements, for example, in Vietnam. I think this Western urban guerrilla warfare, or terrorism, if you like to call it, were never supported by Maoist China, and by the mid-1970s also the references of the Red Army faction to China more or less disappeared. So now let me conclude. I think to explain this huge popularity of various brands of Maoism in the 1960s and early 1970s is linked to this global environment in which we saw overlapping of revolutionary cycles in the Global South with workers and student protests in the centers of the capitalist world system, especially in the years of 68 and 69. Positive perception of China varied from the Chinese Revolution as a successful model for guerrilla warfare in a so-called semi-feudal, semi-colonial country, the Cultural Revolution as an authoritarian youth revolt. This was more or less around the year of 68, and then later in the early 1970s, China was seen as a model, and Maoism was seen as a model to build an orthodox and authoritarian Marxist-Leninist party. And beyond all these left-wing movements, China was seen as a force by many in the global south and the global north to overcome a bipolar order of the world of the two superpowers, and also neutralists in the global north made positive references to China. If you know German, I also edited this reader on Maoism, where you also can find some then German translation of French and Italian debates, and also text from China. So I want to end here, and in the second part, in the next video, I will analyze what people could know about the dark sides of the Cultural Revolution in Maoist China at this time, and why and how Maoist movements would decline by the mid-1970s. So thanks a lot for your attention, and goodbye.